Karen strutted into the high-end department store, her designer heels clicking against the polished marble floor. She held her head high, her expensive handbag swinging at her wrist, and her sharp eyes scanning the store like a queen surveying her kingdom. Everything about her screamed wealth: her perfectly styled blonde bob, her tailored coat, and the large diamond ring on her finger. But beneath the luxury, there was something else: an unmistakable air of entitlement. Karen prided herself on her ability to recognize people who belonged and those who didn't. To her, money was everything, and appearances told her all she needed to know about a person. If you weren't dressed in designer brands or didn't carry yourself with a certain confidence, you were beneath her. As she strolled toward the store's luxury handbag section, something caught her eye. Or rather, someone. An old man, hunched slightly, slowly browsed a display of items a few aisles away. His clothes were well worn, his shoes scuffed, and his gray hair unkempt. His jacket, though clean, looked years old and too big for him, hanging loosely from his frail shoulders. He picked up an item, examined it carefully, then set it back down, moving without any sense of urgency. Karen wrinkled her nose in distaste. What was someone like him doing in this store? Was he lost? Did he wander in thinking it was a thrift shop? She scoffed at the thought, shaking her head as she continued walking. Still, she couldn't help but steal another glance at him. The way he moved, taking his time, made her assume he wasn't planning to buy anything. To her, he looked like someone who had no business being in a store that catered to people of her status. She smirked, wondering if he was just there to admire things he could never afford. A sales associate passed by, politely greeting the old man. Karen raised an eyebrow. Why was the staff acknowledging him? Surely they should be paying attention to her instead. She cleared her throat loudly, expecting the employee to turn their focus toward her, but they simply smiled and continued assisting another customer. Annoyed, she decided she had seen enough. She walked toward the old man, barely masking her amusement. "You sure you're in the right place?" she asked with a condescending chuckle. "This isn't exactly a bargain store, you know." The old man looked up at her with kind, twinkling eyes, seemingly unfazed by her words. He gave her a small, polite smile but said nothing, returning his attention to the item he had been looking at. Karen scoffed. "Well, good luck affording anything here," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head as she turned away. Little did she know, the man she had just mocked wasn't just another customer. He was the owner of the entire store, and she was about to learn that the hard way. Karen sauntered through the store, her heels clicking with confidence as she examined the latest designer bags and accessories. She felt in her element, surrounded by luxury and exclusivity. However, her attention kept drifting back to the old man wandering through the aisles at a sluggish pace. She watched as he reached for a small, elegantly packaged perfume bottle on a glass shelf. His hands, wrinkled with age, trembled slightly as he lifted it. For a moment, he studied the label carefully, squinting as if trying to read the fine print. Then, just as he was about to place it back, the bottle slipped from his grasp. The old man fumbled, trying to catch it, but his reflexes weren't quick enough. The bottle landed on the soft carpeted floor without breaking, but the sudden motion drew attention from several nearby shoppers. Karen let out an exaggerated gasp and placed a manicured hand over her chest, as if the man had just committed a grave crime. "Oh dear," she said, loud enough for everyone around to hear. "I suppose that's what happens when you touch things you can't afford." A few customers glanced in her direction, some frowning in disapproval. An employee hurried over to check on the old man, but he simply waved them away with a polite smile and carefully bent down to pick up the bottle. Karen wasn't done. She folded her arms and smirked. "Honestly, what are you even doing here?" she scoffed. "This isn't a charity shop. People like you shouldn't waste their time dreaming about things they'll never buy." The air in the store grew tense. A woman browsing handbags shot Karen a disapproving look, while a young couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. The old man, however, remained calm. He straightened up, bottle in hand, and met Karen's gaze with a quiet patience that only made her more irritated. He still hadn't said a word to her. Karen rolled her eyes. I mean, just look at you, she continued, laughing dryly. That coat looks older than I am. Are you here to window shop? Or just hoping someone will take pity on you and buy you something? A store employee stepped forward, looking as though they were about to intervene, but before they could, the old man chuckled softly. It wasn't a bitter or embarrassed laugh. It was warm, almost amused. Karen frowned. What's so funny? She snapped. The old man simply shook his head and set the perfume bottle back on the shelf with great care. Oh, nothing, he said gently, his voice calm and steady. It's just interesting how quickly people judge what they don't understand. Karen narrowed her eyes, confused by his response. She was expecting anger, maybe even an apology, but not this strange sense of quiet confidence. She scoffed, turning to a nearby employee. Well, don't just stand there, she huffed. Aren't you going to throw him out? I mean, he clearly doesn't belong here. The employee hesitated, exchanging a glance with the old man. It was the kind of look that suggested something Karen didn't yet realize, something she was about to find out. A young store assistant named Emily had been watching the exchange from behind the checkout counter. She had seen Karen come in before, always demanding, always loud, and always treating the staff like they were beneath her. But today, she had crossed a line. Emily stepped forward, her voice steady but polite. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to stop speaking to him that way. Karen whipped her head around, her expression incredulous. Excuse me? She scoffed. You work here, don't you? Shouldn't you be dealing with… She waved a dismissive hand toward the old man. People like him instead of lecturing paying customers? Emily remained composed, standing her ground. Our store welcomes everyone, she said firmly. There's no reason to treat him poorly just because of how he looks. Karen let out a dramatic sigh, placing a hand on her hip. Oh, please, you really think he's here to buy anything? Look at him. He's probably just loitering around, hoping someone forgets their wallet so he can snatch it up. She turned to another employee who had walked over, an older gentleman named Mark. You should really do your job and ask him to leave before he makes your real customers uncomfortable. Mark, who had worked at the store for years, knew exactly who the old man was, but he said nothing. Instead, he crossed his arms and studied Karen carefully. And what makes you think he doesn't belong here, ma'am? He asked. Karen rolled her eyes as if the answer was obvious. Oh, I don't know, she said sarcastically. Maybe the raggedy old coat? The fact that he can barely hold a bottle without dropping it? The way he's just wandering around like he has nowhere else to be? She laughed, shaking her head. Come on, it's clear as day. He's either lost or looking for a handout. Through all of this, the old man remained quiet, his expression calm, his eyes twinkling with an unreadable emotion. Was it amusement? Understanding? It certainly wasn't anger. Then, much to Karen's frustration, he did something that infuriated her even more. He smiled. Not a nervous smile, not an embarrassed one. A warm, knowing smile, as if he had seen this scenario play out 100 times before. Karen felt her patience snap. Why are you smiling? Do you think this is funny? The old man tilted his head slightly. Not funny, he said in a soft, even voice. Just interesting. Karen scoffed, turning back to Mark and Emily. Well, are you going to call security or should I? Before either employee could respond, another voice joined the conversation, one that instantly silenced the entire room. A deep, authoritative voice that carried a weight Karen didn't yet understand. That won't be necessary. Karen turned, and her face paled as she realized the man who had just spoken wasn't just another employee. He was the store's manager. And from the look on his face, he had heard everything. Karen barely had time to process the sudden shift in the atmosphere before the store manager, a tall, well-dressed man with a commanding presence, approached the small group. His sharp eyes moved from the store employees to Karen, and finally to the old man, where his expression softened into one of deep respect. "Mr. Harrington," the manager said warmly, offering a polite nod. "I didn't realize you were in today." The old man, still smiling, gave a small chuckle. "Ah, I like to drop in now and then," he said, his voice carrying a casual ease. "It's always interesting to see how things are going from a customer's perspective." Karen felt the blood drain from her face. "Mr. Harrington?" She glanced between the manager and the old man, her mind scrambling to make sense of what she had just heard. Surely this was a mistake. The manager turned to her, his gaze now sharp and unreadable. "Is there a problem here?" Karen forced a laugh, her tone suddenly a lot less confident. "Oh no, no problem at all. I was just, well, I was just a little surprised to see—" She hesitated, then forced a nervous smile. "Mr. Harrington here. I I didn't realize he was, you know." "The owner of this store?" The manager finished for her, his tone polite but firm. Karen swallowed hard. "Yes, exactly. I had no idea. I mean, if I'd known, Mr. Harrington raised a hand, cutting her off gently. "That's the point, isn't it?" he said, his voice calm but pointed. "You judged me based on how I looked. You assumed I didn't belong here, that I couldn't afford anything, simply because I wasn't dressed the way you expected." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. The reality of the situation was settling in, heavy and humiliating. Emily, the store assistant, cleared her throat, stepping forward. "Mr. Harrington likes to visit his stores in disguise from time to time," she explained. "He does this to observe how customers are treated when no one knows who he is." Mark, the older employee, nodded. "It's his way of ensuring that everyone, regardless of how they look, is treated with kindness and respect." Karen's face turned an even deeper shade of red. She had spent the last several minutes mocking and belittling the very man who owned the entire store, maybe even the entire chain. Mr. Harrington sighed, turning to the manager. "It's always disappointing to see behavior like this, but I suppose it's a good reminder of why I do these visits in the first place." Karen forced a tight smile, desperately trying to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Harrington, I really didn't mean any harm," she said quickly. "I was just surprised, that's all. But Mr. Harrington wasn't looking for an apology. Instead, he simply met her gaze and said, "I hope this experience teaches you something." Karen had never felt so small in her life. Karen stood frozen, her face pale, her confidence shattered. The entire store had gone quiet, and every pair of eyes was on her. Just moments ago, she had been laughing at an old man, convinced he didn't belong here. Now she realized, too late, that he was the owner of the entire store. Mr. Harrington turned to her, his expression calm but firm. "We do not tolerate rude behavior toward anyone in my stores, Miss—" Karen swallowed hard. "Karen," she mumbled. "Karen," he repeated, nodding. "I've built these stores on the foundation of respect and quality service. That applies not only to my employees, but also to my customers. I can't allow anyone, no matter how much they spend, to treat others the way you did today." Karen's mouth opened and closed as she tried to think of something to say, some excuse, some way to fix this. I didn't mean anything by it," she stammered. "I just thought—" Mr. Harrington raised a hand to stop her. "You thought that because I didn't dress like you, I didn't belong," he said simply. "That kind of thinking is what I work hard to prevent in my stores." Karen's hands clenched at her sides. She wanted to argue, to insist that she wasn't the bad person here. But there was no arguing with the truth, not when she had humiliated herself in front of an entire store. Then, as if to drive the point home, Mr. Harrington turned away from her and walked toward an elderly woman near the checkout. She had been standing quietly nearby, watching the entire exchange. Her clothes were simple but clean, and she held a few small items in her hands. Basic necessities. Mr. Harrington smiled warmly at her. "Allow me to take care of that for you," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his wallet. The woman's eyes widened. "Oh, no, I couldn't—" "Please," Mr. Harrington insisted gently. "It would be my pleasure." The cashier nodded and rang up the items while the elderly woman thanked him profusely. The contrast between his kindness and Karen's cruelty was painfully obvious to everyone watching. Karen's face burned with shame. She had spent the last several minutes tearing someone down, only to be shown up by the very man she had mocked. She took a shaky breath and turned back to Mr. Harrington. "Listen, The store manager stepped forward before she could finish. "I think it's time for you to leave, Miss Karen." Karen's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone who disrespects our customers or staff," the manager said firmly. "You've made your opinions clear today, and we won't be needing your business anymore." Karen's breath hitched. She wanted to argue, to insist that this was unfair. But she saw the looks from the employees, from the other customers. No one was on her side. With as much dignity as she could muster, she spun on her heel and stormed toward the exit, her face burning with humiliation. As the doors swung shut behind her, Mr. Harrington simply shook his head and sighed. Some lessons are harder to learn than others. The staff and customers around him nodded in agreement, and just like that, the store returned to business as usual. Karen stormed out of the store, her designer heels clacking angrily against the polished floor. Her face was flushed with embarrassment, and she could feel the stares of the employees and customers lingering on her as she pushed through the glass doors. The cool air outside hit her like a slap, but it did nothing to cool her temper. She grumbled under her breath, barely aware of where she was walking. "Unbelievable. What kind of business kicks out a paying customer just for telling the truth?" she muttered. "That old man shouldn't even have been there. How was I supposed to know he owned the place?" But even as she said it, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. Deep down, she knew the truth. This wasn't about whether Mr. Harrington could afford to be there. It was about how she had treated him, assuming his worth based on his appearance alone. And now she had paid the price for it. For the first time, a thought crossed her mind that made her stomach twist uncomfortably. Had she ever been on the receiving end of such judgment? Had anyone ever looked at her and assumed things about her based on nothing more than what they saw? She had always believed that wealth and status set people apart, but today she had seen firsthand how easily power and privilege could shift. She stopped walking, glancing back at the store behind her. Through the glass, she could see Mr. Harrington still standing near the counter, chatting warmly with the employees. There was no anger in his face, no smugness at having put her in her place, just the same quiet kindness he had shown all along. Karen exhaled sharply, annoyed with herself. She didn't want to admit it, but a part of her regretted how she had acted. She could have handled the situation differently. Maybe if she had just minded her own business, she wouldn't have humiliated herself so thoroughly. Still, she wasn't ready to completely accept her mistake. "Whatever," she huffed, turning on her heel. "I'll just shop somewhere else." Inside the store. The moment Karen was gone, the tense atmosphere lifted and the store returned to normal. Employees resumed their work, customers continued browsing, and Mr. Harrington simply chuckled to himself. Emily, the young store assistant, turned to him with an apologetic look. "I'm really sorry about that, sir. I should have stepped in sooner." Mr. Harrington waved a hand dismissively. "You did just fine," he assured her. People will always reveal their true nature when they think no one important is watching. Today was just another reminder of that. Mark, the older employee, smirked. "Think she'll learn anything from this?" Mr. Harrington let out a thoughtful hum. "Maybe, maybe not." He glanced toward the door where Karen had left. "Some people change, some don't, but that's not our problem. What matters is that we continue treating everyone with respect, no matter who they are." The employees nodded in agreement, then returned to their tasks. And just like that, life moved on, lesson learned or not.